The Galactic Council had been standing for over 12,000 standard cycles. It was the oldest governing body in all of known space, and every species that had ever crawled out of the dark and learned to build a ship eventually found their way to its doors. The Council sat inside an enormous dome made of living crystal on a world called Verath Prime. 614 species held seats there, 614 flags, 614 voices. And not a single one of them was allowed to speak the truth. That was the first thing Sam Moran learned when he arrived. Sam was not the kind of man anyone would look at twice. He was 46 years old, average height, thinning hair, and he wore the same gray suit to every meeting because he only owned two. He had been a mid-level diplomat back on Earth, the kind of man who spent most of his career writing reports that no one read and attending meetings that never led anywhere. When the United Nations needed someone to lead the first human delegation to the Galactic Council, Sam's name had come up mostly because no one more important wanted the job. It was a long trip. The food would be strange, and no one was sure the aliens would even let them stay. But Sam said yes. He packed his gray suits and boarded the Steady Horizon, a small frigate that the human government had polished up as best it could. It still looked like a tugboat parked next to an ocean liner when they docked at Verath Prime. The elder species had ships that stretched for kilometers. The Steady Horizon could have fit inside one of their cargo bays. Sam did not care about the ship. He cared about the briefing packet. The packet was 3,000 pages long. Most of it was taken up by a single document called the Protocol of Measured Speech. This was the set of rules that every council delegate was required to follow when speaking during formal sessions. Sam read it cover to cover during the trip. His aide, a young linguist named Katie Vaughn, read it twice. The protocol was, in simple terms, a list of everything you were not allowed to say. You could not mention a species by name in connection with any negative action. You could not use language that implied blame, aggression, or judgment. You could not refer to biological differences between species. You could not bring up historical conflicts. You could not use emotional language. You could not raise your voice. Every word spoken in the council chamber passed through a translation matrix, a machine that converted speech into the 614 languages of the member species, while also filtering out anything the system considered dangerous, offensive, or destabilizing. What came out the other end was always polite, and it was always calm, and it almost never said anything real. Katie finished the document first. She sat across from Sam in the small mess hall of the Steady Horizon and set the tablet down on the table between them. "So they built a government where nobody is allowed to tell the truth," she said. Sam picked up the tablet and scrolled through the table of contents one more time. Section after section after section of things that could not be named, feelings that could not be expressed, and problems that could not be described in honest language. "Looks that way," he said. They were given a seat in the outermost ring of the council chamber. This was normal for new species. You sat at the back, you watched, you learned the rules, and you kept your mouth shut for the first several cycles until the elder species decided you had earned the right to participate. Sam did what he was told. He sat in his small seat at the edge of the enormous room, and he watched. And the chamber itself was something to see. The crystal dome above was transparent, and the stars of the Verath system burned through it day and night. The seats were arranged in concentric rings that descended toward a central platform, like an amphitheater built for giants. Each delegation had a section fitted to their biology. Some seats were pools of liquid, some were hanging perches, some were pressurized chambers filled with gas. The variety of life in that room was staggering, and Sam spent his first week just trying to learn which species was which. But it was the sessions themselves that held his attention. He watched the Draelith ambassador stand before the council and try to explain that his people were running out of food. The Draelith were a quiet, gentle species, and their ambassador was an elderly creature with soft brown fur and trembling hands. He spoke for almost 20 minutes, but every time he tried to explain why his people were hungry, but the translation matrix softened his words. What the council heard was a calm discussion about agricultural adjustments in the mid-rim territories. The real problem, that a neighboring species had deliberately diverted a shared river system to starve the Dralith into giving up a border dispute, was never stated. It could not be stated. Naming the species responsible was a violation of Section 7. Describing the diversion as deliberate was a violation of Section 12. Using the word starve was a violation of Section 3, which prohibited language implying biological harm caused by another member. The Dralith ambassador sat down. The council moved on to the next item. Nothing happened. Sam wrote a note on his tablet. Just one word. Starving. The next week, he watched the Torvan delegate try to file a complaint about illegal mining operations in their home system. The complaint was rejected on procedural grounds because the language used was flagged as implying hostility toward an unnamed party, the Torvan delegate argued. The chamber moderator apologized and moved on. Sam wrote another note. Mining, rejected. The week after that, he watched a small insectoid species called the Vreli try to warn the council about a growing pirate fleet near their border worlds. The Vreli ambassador was a fragile creature named Tikat, odd no bigger than a human child with iridescent wings that flickered when he was frightened. Tikat was frightened often. He stood on the central platform and described attacks on his people's cargo ships, raids on their outer colonies, and the disappearance of an entire settlement on a moon called Vreth 4. But when he tried to name the species responsible for the attacks, his microphone cut out. Section 14, subsection 9. You could not accuse a member species of organized violence without first submitting a formal evidence review, which required the approval of 12 senior delegates, which took a minimum of 2 years. Tikat's wings stopped flickering. He stood there in silence for a long moment, and then he returned to his seat. The council moved on. Sam wrote one more note. He showed it to Katie that evening in their quarters. On it read, "They are going to let them die." Katie looked at the note for a long time. Then she looked at Sam. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Sam did not answer right away. He sat by the window of the steady horizon and looked out at the crystal dome glowing against the dark sky of Vareth Prime. Somewhere out there, past the edge of council space, the Vreli were under attack, and in the most powerful room in the galaxy, no one was allowed to say so. "No, I do not know yet," Sam said quietly. "But I am not going to sit in that back row forever." Katie nodded. She pulled up her translation equipment and began working on something she had been thinking about for weeks. If the translation matrix was the lock, then the backup audio systems were the door. Every room had them, old analog channels built into the original architecture of the chamber, meant for emergencies. They had not been used in centuries. Katie was very good at her job, and she had a feeling she was about to become very busy. 6 standard months passed. Sam attended every session. He sat in his small seat in the outermost ring and he listened. He took notes. He learned the names of every delegate and every species and every unspoken rule that held the council together like old glue on a cracked wall. And with every session, the crack got wider. The Vreli situation had gone from bad to terrible, and the pirate fleet that Tikat had tried to warn the council about had grown. It was no longer a scattered group of raiders. It was an organized invasion force, funded and equipped by a powerful criminal network called the Korvati Syndicate. Everyone knew it. The intelligence services of at least 30 species had confirmed it. But no one could say the word Korvati on the council floor because the Korvati were technically a recognized sub-faction of a member species, and naming them required a formal review that no one had the votes to approve. 3 Vreli colony worlds were now under siege. Supply lines had been cut. Communications had been jammed. Refugees were dying in transport ships that had nowhere to go. The numbers, the ones that Katie pulled from independent monitoring stations, were horrifying. Tens of thousands dead, millions displaced, and the rate was climbing. T-Cat came to the podium every single session. His wings barely moved anymore, and his voice, even before the translation matrix touched it, was flat and exhausted. He had stopped trying to name the Korvathi. He had stopped trying to use strong language. He simply stood there and asked for help in the most polite, most careful, most rule-following way he could manage. And every single time the translation matrix turned his desperation into a gentle request for continued consideration of logistical concerns in the outer sectors. The delegates listened politely, and some of them nodded, and then they moved on. Sam watched this happen 14 times. On the 15th session, he made his decision. The night before, he sat down with Katie in the communications room of the Steady Horizon. She had spent the last 3 months mapping the backup audio systems in the council chamber. They were old, built into the walls when the dome was first constructed thousands of years ago. They were designed for emergencies, for situations where the main systems failed, while they bypassed the translation matrix entirely. Raw audio, unfiltered, broadcast to every speaker in the room. "Can you do it?" Sam asked. Katie looked at her screens. Lines of code and signal diagrams filled every display. "I can route your microphone through the backup channel," she said. "When you speak, it will go out in English, unfiltered. Every species will hear your actual voice. The translation matrix will still try to process it, but there will be a delay. For about 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, you will be speaking directly to every delegate in that room." 2 minutes, Sam said. "Maybe less. The system will catch up and try to override, but for that window, yes, your real words." Sam nodded slowly. He looked down at the tablet on the table. He had written notes during every session for 6 months, hundreds of entries, problems buried, crises ignored, species suffering in silence while the most powerful institution in the galaxy discussed procedure. "What happens to us after?" he asked. Katie did not pretend it would be fine. "They will probably expel us, maybe worse. The Korvathi have allies on the council. If you name them publicly, those allies will push for serious consequences." "And if I do not name them?" Katie pulled up the latest casualty figures from the Vreli border. She did not say anything. She just let him read the numbers. Sam read them. He closed the tablet. He stood up. "Set it up," he said. The next morning, the council convened for its regular session. The agenda was long and dull, filled with trade regulations and environmental reports and a dispute over shipping lanes that had been going back and forth for 11 years. T-Cat was scheduled to speak during the final hour, as usual. Sam sat in his seat and waited. He had not told anyone on his delegation what he was going to do except Katie. He did not want anyone else to carry the blame. He wore his gray suit. He looked like exactly what he was, an ordinary man in a room full of extraordinary beings. When T-Cat took the podium, Sam watched the little ambassador try one more time. T-Cat's voice was barely a whisper. His wings hung flat against his back. He described the situation on Vreth 4, where the last settlement had gone silent 2 days ago. He asked the council, as he had asked 14 times before, for assistance. The translation matrix did its work. The delegates heard a polite summary of minor logistical issues. A few of them checked their personal devices. One delegate from one of the larger species actually fell asleep. T-Cat finished. He turned to walk back to his seat. His legs were unsteady. Sam stood up. The movement itself was enough to draw attention. New species did not stand during session. They certainly did not leave their seats. A few delegates turned to look. The chamber moderator, an automated system with a calm, synthetic voice, that issued a polite reminder that the delegate from Earth had not been recognized to speak. Sam walked down the steps toward the central platform. The moderator issued a second warning, then a third. Light barriers appeared on the steps ahead of him, soft blue walls of energy meant to redirect him back to his seat. Sam walked through them. They were designed to be polite, not to physically stop anyone. He reached the podium. He looked out at the chamber. 614 species, thousands of delegates. The crystal dome above him was filled with starlight. Somewhere in the observation gallery, Katie pressed a button on her personal console. The backup audio channel opened. "The Vreli are dying," Sam said. His voice filled the chamber. Not the translation matrix's version, not a softened, filtered, carefully adjusted version. His actual voice, speaking plain English, rough and real and loud enough to reach every corner of the dome. And the translation matrix scrambled to catch up. But for those crucial seconds, every species in the room heard the raw sound of a human being telling the truth. 3 of their worlds are under attack by the Korvathi Syndicate. Everyone in this room knows it. Everyone has known it for months, and no one has done anything because your rules will not let you say the word Korvathi out loud. The silence in the chamber was unlike anything anyone there had ever experienced. It was not the comfortable silence of agreement or the diplomatic silence of restraint. It was the silence of 614 species hearing something real for the first time in living memory. Sam kept going. He had 2 minutes, maybe less, and he was not going to waste a second. "I have sat in that back row for 6 months. I have watched the Drelith beg for food and get ignored. I have watched the Torvan file complaints that your system throws away because the language is too honest. I have watched Ambassador Tikat come to this podium session after session and try to tell you that his people are being slaughtered, and every single time, your machine turns his screams into a whisper." He pointed at Tikat, who had stopped walking and was standing frozen in the aisle, his wings trembling. "We hear you," Sam said directly to him. "Humanity hears you. And we are not going to be quiet about it." The translation matrix finally caught up. The backup channel was overridden. Sam's microphone went dead. But it did not matter. The words were already out. They hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away, impossible to ignore. And then the chamber broke open. It did not happen like a fight. It happened like a dam giving way. Delegates began to speak, not through the matrix, but around it, over it, beneath it. They shouted at each other in their own languages. They stood up from their seats. The Drelith ambassador began to weep openly. The Torvain delegate slammed his massive fist on his console and roared something that needed no translation. A dozen small species from the outer rings began calling out their own grievances, their own buried crises, their own silent suffering. Consul Dreth, the senior Fasari delegate, rose from his ancient seat in the innermost ring and called for order. And he invoked Section 1 of the protocol. He demanded Sam's immediate removal. His golden eyes were blazing. But the noise did not stop. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Galactic Council was hearing itself speak, and it could not unhear what had been said. Sam stood on the podium and watched it all happen. His hands were shaking. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Katie, up in the gallery, had tears running down her face. It was chaos. It was messy and loud and frightening and completely against every rule ever written. And for the first time since humanity had walked through those doors, it was honest. The morning after Sam's speech, the council chamber was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a room full of people who had heard something they could not forget and did not know what to do about it. Sam was formally censured within the first hour of the emergency session, and his speaking privileges were revoked. He was confined to the observation gallery, which meant he could watch the proceedings but could not set foot on the chamber floor. A motion was introduced by the Korvathi-aligned bloc to revoke humanity's membership entirely and expel the delegation from Verith Prime. Consul Dreth seconded the motion personally. He called Sam's actions an assault on the foundations of galactic civilization and demanded that the Council send a message to every young species watching from the edges of known space. Rules mattered, order mattered. One man's outburst could not be allowed to tear down what 12,000 years had built. It was a powerful argument. Many delegates agreed with it. The vote on expulsion was scheduled for the following week. But something was already happening that Dreth and his allies had not expected. Sam had spoken in plain, unfiltered English. Katie had routed his voice through the backup audio systems. But what neither of them had known was that the backup systems were connected to the Council's external broadcast network, an old emergency channel that automatically transmitted to every communication relay in Council space. Sam's words had not just reached the delegates in the room. They had reached the entire galaxy. Within hours, independent news agencies on dozens of worlds were running the story. The Vreli crisis, which had been invisible to the general public because the protocol kept it off the official record, was suddenly everywhere. Analysts broke down Sam's speech line by line. Journalists began investigating the Korvathi syndicate. Communication networks that had never shown interest in council politics were now broadcasting non-stop coverage. And the Vreli themselves, the small, fragile, insectoid people who had been suffering in silence for months, suddenly found that they were not alone. Messages of support poured in from across the galaxy. Supply ships from species that had never even met a Vreli began heading toward the besieged colonies. Military commanders from 4 different species, acting without formal council authorization, assembled a joint relief fleet and set course for the Vreli border. And the siege was broken in 11 days. The Korvathi syndicate, exposed and named for the first time on the galactic stage, collapsed almost as fast. Their allies pulled away. Their funding sources dried up. Their leadership scattered into the deep territories beyond Council space. Within a month, the organization that had terrorized the Vreli for nearly a year was effectively destroyed, not by a fleet or a weapon, but by the simple act of someone saying their name out loud. And back on Vareth Prime, the political situation was more complicated. The vote on humanity's expulsion was still scheduled. Dreth was still pushing for it. But the mood in the council had shifted in ways that were hard to measure. Delegates who had privately sympathized with Sam were now facing pressure from their own populations to speak up. And the Vreli rescue had proven something that many species had long suspected but never dared to say. The protocol of measured speech was not keeping the peace. It was hiding the wars. A new faction began to form. They called themselves the Open Voice Coalition, and they were led by a tall, feathered diplomat from the Selhari people named Aelith. The Selhari were a mid-tier species, not powerful enough to challenge the elder races directly, but respected enough to be taken seriously. Aelith had been on the council for 20 years. She had watched the same slow suffocation of truth that Sam had seen in 6 months. The difference was that Aelith had never had the option of doing anything about it. The protocol applied to everyone except, apparently, humans. Aelith sought out the human delegation privately. She met with Katie Vaughn in a neutral location, a small garden terrace on the lower levels of the diplomatic quarter. Katie was serving as acting head of the delegation while Sam dealt with the censure proceedings. "Your man broke every rule we have," Aelith said. Her crest feathers were flat against her skull, a sign that Katie's cultural notes told her could mean amusement, respect, or both. "He did," Katie agreed. "And he saved more lives in 5 minutes than this council has saved in 50 cycles." Katie chose her next words carefully. "We did not come here looking for a fight." Aelith tilted her head. "No, you came here to be honest. That is much more dangerous." The expulsion vote was delayed twice. The Open Voice Coalition introduced procedural motions, stalling for time while they built support among the smaller species. Meanwhile, Sam was summoned before a formal tribunal, a special panel drawn from 200 species that would review his actions and recommend a course of action to the full council. And the tribunal lasted 3 months. Representatives from across the galaxy questioned Sam about his motives, his methods, and his understanding of the consequences. Many were hostile. The Korvathi delegate, a cold, gray-skinned figure named Voss, demanded that Sam be handed over for prosecution under Korvathi law. Others wanted humanity quarantined, cut off from galactic society, and left to develop on their own for another 1,000 years until they learned how civilized species behaved. For the first time in months, and told the tribunal, his wings bright and steady for the first time in months, and told the panel what it had felt like to beg for help in a room where no one was allowed to hear him. "I came to the council because I believed it was the place where justice lived," Tikat said. "And for a long time I thought justice was dead. Then the humans stood up, and I learned that justice was not dead, and it had only been silenced." Sam's defense was not complicated. He did not try to argue that what he had done was legal. He did not claim that the rules did not apply to him. He stood before the tribunal in his gray suit and made one argument. "Every species in this chamber has lost people because of things that could not be said. I am not asking you to throw away your traditions. I am asking you to look at the cost. Look at the Draelith, who are still hungry. Look at the Torvan, Sioux, who are still being mined out of their own system. Look at the Vreli, who almost lost everything because no one in this room was allowed to say one name out loud. And then tell me honestly whether the price of silence is really lower than the price of hearing something uncomfortable." The tribunal deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, the lead arbiter, an ancient being from a species so old that no one remembered their original name, read the recommendation aloud. Humanity would not be expelled. The vote was close, 312 in favor of keeping humanity to 302 in favor of removal. But the margin held. Instead, a new provision was added to the council's charter. It was drafted by the Open Voice Coalition with input from the human delegation and quietly supported by enough elder species to pass. They called it the Moran Compact, though Sam told Katie he wished they had picked a different name. The compact was simple. The human delegation, and only the human delegation, was exempt from the protocol of measured speech. Humans could say whatever they wanted, name whoever they wanted, and raise any topic they wanted, without filter, without restriction, and without interference from the translation matrix. In exchange, humans accepted full diplomatic responsibility for everything they said. If human speech caused a war, humanity would bear the consequences. If human words were proven false, humanity would face sanctions. The freedom was real, but so was the weight that came with it. It was a compromise. The council did not want to change the protocol. It did not want to admit that its oldest tradition was flawed. But it could not pretend that Sam had been wrong, not with the Vreli alive and the Korvathi gone and the whole galaxy watching. So it gave humanity a narrow door and hoped that would be enough. Sam signed the compact in a quiet ceremony with no cameras and no audience, and he shook hands with Aelith and nodded to Consul Dreth, who refused to nod back. Then he returned to the steady horizon and sat by the window. Katie found him there an hour later. "It is not enough," she said. "One species speaking freely in a room of 600. It is a start, but it is not enough." Sam looked out at the stars. "No," he said, "but it is a door, and doors can be opened wider." Sam Moran retired 3 years after the compact was signed. He went back to Earth. He could, and it was time for someone better could, and it was time for someone better to take over. Most people thought he was being modest. Katie Vaughn, who knew him better than almost anyone, thought he was being honest. Sam had never wanted to be a symbol. He had just wanted to do the right thing, and the weight of being the man who changed the galaxy was more than he was built to carry. That his replacement was a woman named Claire Dunbar. Claire was 41 years old when she took over the human delegation. She had spent 15 years as a war correspondent, covering conflicts on 3 continents, before she moved into diplomacy. She had seen what silence could do. She had interviewed warlords who operated freely because no one was willing to name them in public. And she had sat in refugee camps where the victims knew exactly who had destroyed their homes but could not get anyone with power to say it on the record. When the position at Vareth Prime was offered to her, she took it without hesitation. Claire was different from Sam in almost every way. Where Sam had been reluctant and careful, Claire was precise and fearless. Where Sam had stumbled into his moment, Claire planned hers. She arrived at Vareth Prime with a staff of 12, including a careful analyst named Dan Hartley, who became her deputy and her most important collaborator. Dan was not a diplomat. He was an intelligence analyst, the kind of person who read 14 reports before breakfast and could find the one sentence that mattered in 1,000 pages of noise. He had spent a decade working in data analysis before Claire recruited him. He was not comfortable in the spotlight. He was comfortable in the details. He would take the central podium and deliver what she called a State of the Galaxy address. She would speak freely as the Moran Compact permitted, and she would provide a complete and honest assessment of the conditions across Council space. She would name names. She would cite numbers. She would describe situations that the protocol had kept hidden. The Council's elder delegates dismissed it as theater. Consul Dreth, still bitter about the compact, called it a performance by a species too young to understand the value of restraint. The first naming session, as the press quickly began calling them, proved everyone wrong. Claire stood on the central podium in a dark blue suit and spoke for 47 minutes. She described a famine on 2 Draelith worlds caused by ongoing water diversion that the Council had still not addressed. She named the species responsible. She provided satellite imagery that Dan's team had collected independently. She described a weapons buildup by a coalition of 3 species along the border of a smaller neighbor, complete with fleet positions, supply chain analysis, and intercepted communications that proved the buildup was preparation for invasion, not defense as the coalition claimed. She described conditions in a forced labor facility on a moon controlled by the Tessari Commerce Guild, where members of 2 conquered species were being worked to death in mining operations. She read the estimated death toll. She described the ages of the youngest workers. She did all of this in a calm, steady voice, without emotion, without drama, and without a single word that could be called inaccurate. And the chamber was silent through the entire address. When Claire finished, she stepped down from the podium and returned to her seat. She did not wait for a response. She did not engage in debate. She simply presented the truth and let it sit. The reaction was enormous. The naming sessions became the most watched events in galactic politics. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds tuned in every cycle to hear what the human delegation would say next. Independent journalists, and inspired by Claire's example, began conducting their own investigations. A new kind of galactic media was being born, one that valued facts over diplomatic comfort. Not everyone was happy about it. The Korvathi remnants, still scattered but still angry, launched a campaign to have the Moran Compact revoked. They gathered support from every species that had been named in a naming session, and the list was growing. The Tessari Commerce Guild denied everything Claire had said about the labor facility and accused humanity of fabricating evidence. 3 separate assassination attempts were made on Claire's life in the first 2 years. She survived all 3. Though the second one left a scar on her left arm that she never bothered to hide. "It reminds me why this matters," she told Katie Vaughn, who had stayed on as a senior advisor. "The people who want to kill you for telling the truth are usually the ones who prove you need to tell it." Behind every word Claire spoke, Dan Hartley's operation was running at full speed. He had built a network of human journalists, field researchers, and intelligence contacts spread across Council space. They gathered data from open sources, independent monitoring stations, refugee testimony, and sometimes from whistleblowers inside the governments being named. Every claim in every naming session was verified at least 3 times before Claire said it out loud. Every number was checked. Every name was confirmed. This was the part that most species did not understand at first. They assumed the naming sessions were emotional outbursts, the same kind of reckless honesty that Sam had shown in his original speech. They were not. They were the product of months of careful, methodical work. Claire and Dan understood something that gave the Moran Compact its real power. Free speech without truth was just noise. The right to speak freely meant nothing if what you said could be dismissed as rumor or opinion. The strength of the human delegation was not that they could talk. It was that when they talked, they were right. The proof came during Claire's 7th naming session. She accused the Palathi government of conducting forced sterilization programs on a conquered species called the Neth. The Palathi denied it immediately and with great anger. Their ambassador called Claire a liar on the council floor, which was itself a violation of the protocol, though no one pointed that out at the time. The Palathi demanded an independent investigation. Several elder species, tired of the disruption Claire was causing, agreed. For 3 weeks. It looked like Claire had finally gone too far. Then a Palathi military officer, a mid-ranking doctor who had been stationed at one of the facilities Claire described, released internal documents to the galactic press. Medical records, orders from senior officials, facility logs showing the dates, the names, and the numbers. Everything Claire had said was confirmed. Every detail matched. The Palathi government fell within a month. Not through war or invasion, but through the weight of its own exposed truth. The species they had conquered, the Neth, were granted emergency protections by the Council. A war that had been building for years was prevented because the cause of the war had been dragged into the light before it could explode. After the Palathi incident, no serious delegate ever questioned the accuracy of a naming session again. By the end of Claire's 10-year tenure, the Galactic Council had changed more than it had in the previous 1,000 years. 17 major reform measures had been passed. The translation matrix was modified to allow greater emotional range, a small but meaningful step that the Open Voice Coalition had been pushing for since the beginning. 5 species that had been on the edge of war negotiated settlements through open dialogue for the first time in Council history. The Vreli, once a forgotten minor species in the outer sectors, and to her successor shook Dan's hand, and to her successor shook Dan's hand and caught a transport back to Earth. Dan stayed on for another year to help with the transition, then he left too. He went back to his data work. He never gave a single interview. Years later, a journalist asked Claire what she considered her greatest accomplishment at Vareth Prime. She thought about it for a moment. "I did not accomplish anything," she said. "I just said things out loud that everyone already knew. The accomplishment belongs to the people who listened and decided to act." It was, like most things Claire said, and both humble and precisely true. 40 years had passed since Sam Moran walked down the steps of the outermost ring and spoke the truth to a room that had forgotten what truth sounded like. In that time, the galaxy had changed in ways that even the most hopeful reformers had never imagined. Wars had been prevented. Crises had been exposed and resolved. Species that had suffered in silence for centuries had found their voices, even if those voices still had to pass through the protocol's filters. But the Moran Compact had proven over and over again that honest words had a power that no weapon or fleet could match. But the Compact was still an exception. It still applied only to humans. And as the years went on, that fact began to weigh more heavily on everyone involved. The current head of the human delegation was a man named Ben Cortez. Ben was not what anyone expected a galactic diplomat to look like. He was 53 years old, soft-spoken, and had spent most of his career as a school teacher in a small town before entering public service almost by accident. He had taught history to children for 20 years. He had coached their soccer teams and helped them with their homework and sat with them when they cried about things they did not understand. He had entered diplomacy late, joining the Foreign Service at 40, and had risen through the ranks not because he was brilliant or aggressive, but because people trusted him. For Vareth Prime. Ben had been running the 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 Vareth Prime. Ben had for Vareth Prime. Ben had been running the delegation for 5 years when the special session was called. It was the largest gathering in the Council's history. Every member species sent their full delegation. Observers came from dozens of non-member civilizations, species that had been watching from the edges of known space and wondering whether the changes happening inside the Council would ever reach them. The motion on the floor was simple in its language and enormous in its implications. Extend the rights guaranteed by the Moran Compact to all member species. End the protocol of measured speech as a mandatory system. Let every delegate speak freely. The debate began on a bright morning when the Varath system's twin suns filled the crystal dome with golden light. It would last 11 days. The arguments against the motion were familiar. They had been made for 40 years. The protocol had kept the peace for 12,000 cycles. Free speech led to conflict. Unfiltered language was a weapon. Smaller species would be bullied by larger ones who could shout louder. The translation matrix existed for a reason, and dismantling it would create chaos. Consul Dreth was long dead, but his grandson, a young Fasari named Toval, held his family's seat in the innermost ring. Toval was not like his grandfather. He did not carry the same rigid certainty. but he felt the weight of the tradition he represented, and when he spoke against the motion, he did so with quiet conviction. My grandfather believed that the protocol was the only thing standing between civilization and destruction, Toval said. He believed it until the day he died. I do not ask this council to dismiss that belief. I ask only that we consider what we might lose if we move too quickly. The arguments in favor of the motion were newer but just as powerful. Species after species came to the podium and described what the naming sessions had meant to them. The Neth, the species that the Palathi had nearly destroyed, sent a young delegate who was born in one of the camps that Claire Dunbar had described. And she did not give a political speech. She simply said that she existed because a human had been allowed to say her people's name when no one else could. The Vreli sent a delegation of 7, the largest they had ever brought to the council. Tikat was not among them. He had died 3 years earlier, peacefully, in his home on the rebuilt colony of Vreth 4. But his daughter, a bright-winged young diplomat named Chikit, carried his legacy. And she told the council that her father had spent the last years of his life teaching young Vreli about the day the humans stood up. He told the story so many times that the children could recite it by heart. It had become something close to a legend among the Vreli people. The day silence broke. Aelith, now elderly but still sharp, spoke on behalf of the Open Voice Coalition. She had been pushing for this moment for decades. Her feathers were gray now, and she moved slowly. But her voice was steady. "We gave one species the right to speak for all of us," she said, "and they used that right with more care and more courage than most of us have shown in 12,000 years. But it was never meant to be permanent. The compact was a bridge, not a destination. It is time for every voice in this chamber to carry the same weight." On the 8th day of the debate, it was Ben's turn to speak, and he walked to the central podium the same way Sam Moran had walked to it 40 years before, except this time, no one tried to stop him. No light barriers appeared. No automated warnings sounded. The podium was his by right, earned by 4 decades of humans standing in that spot and telling the truth when no one else was allowed to. Ben did not give a grand speech. He did not name names or reveal hidden crises. He had thought about what to say for weeks, and in the end, he decided that the moment did not need a diplomat. It needed a teacher. He told a story about his daughter, Lily. She was 9 years old and lived back on Earth with her mother. Ben spoke to her every evening through a long-range communication link that stretched across half the galaxy, and even with the signal delay, he never missed a call. A few months ago, Lily had come to him during one of their calls and told him something that had been bothering her, and Lily had seen it happen many times. Lily had seen it happen many times. She wanted to tell someone, but she was afraid. She thought she might get in trouble for speaking up. She thought the older students might turn on her. She thought maybe it was not her place to say anything. So she stayed quiet. And the bullying continued. It went on for weeks, while the boy stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria. He stopped raising his hand in class. He became smaller and smaller, like he was trying to disappear. Finally, Lily could not stand it anymore. She went home and told her parents. Her mother called the school. The principal spoke to the students involved. The situation was resolved in a single day. One day. After weeks of suffering that could have been stopped at any time if someone had simply been willing to say what was happening out loud. Ben looked out at the chamber. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of worlds, beings of every shape and size and biology, all of them watching a school teacher from a small town talk about his daughter. "That is what silence does," Ben said. "It does not prevent the harm. It only delays the moment when someone decides to act. And every day of that delay is a day of suffering for someone who needed help and did not get it." He paused and let the words settle. 40 years ago, A man named Sam Moran broke your rules because a species was dying and no one in this room was allowed to say so. You gave humanity the right to speak freely, and we have tried every single day to use that right the way it deserves to be used. We have made mistakes. We have caused discomfort. We have said things that some of you would have preferred to leave unspoken. But I do not believe there is a single species in this chamber that would trade the last 40 years for the silence that came before. He stepped back from the podium. He did not wait for applause. There was none. There was something better. There was a room full of beings who were looking at each other, really looking, for what felt like the first time. The vote was held on the 12th day, 589 in favor, 25 against. And the protocol of measured speech was reformed. The translation matrices would still operate, converting languages so that everyone could understand each other. But the filters were removed. The censorship protocols were shut down. Emotional content would no longer be stripped. Names could be spoken. Truths could be told. Any delegate who wished to speak plainly could do so. The Moran Compact remained in the Charter as a historical document. It was no longer needed as a legal instrument because the rights it had granted to one species now belonged to everyone. But it stayed in the books as a reminder that there had been a time when only one small, young, unremarkable species had been brave enough or perhaps foolish enough to say what needed to be said in a room where saying it was forbidden. After the vote, Ben stepped out into the hallway. His hands were in his pockets. His eyes were tired, but warm. He was thinking about calling Lily and telling her what had happened. He thought she would like the story. A voice stopped him. Ambassador Cortez. Ben turned. Toval, the young Fasari delegate, was standing behind him. He was tall, with the same golden eyes his grandfather had been famous for. He extended one clawed hand in a gesture he had clearly practiced. A human handshake. It was a little awkward, but the intention was clear. My grandfather believed that silence was the greatest form of diplomacy, Toval said. Ben took his hand and shook it gently. And what do you believe? Ben asked. Toval paused. His golden eyes, so much like the old consul's, flickered with something that looked like the beginning of a new understanding. I believe your species taught us that the truth is not the enemy of peace, Toval said. It is the only foundation strong enough to hold it. Ben smiled. It was a quiet smile, and the kind a teacher gives when a student finally understands the lesson. That is all we ever wanted you to hear, he said. Outside the crystal dome of Verath Prime, the twin suns were setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. Inside the chamber, the delegates were still talking. Not shouting, not arguing, just talking, openly and honestly, in voices that carried their real weight for the first time in 12,000 years. And somewhere, in a small house near the coast on a blue and green world orbiting an ordinary star, an old man named Sam Moran sat on his porch and watched the ocean. He did not know about the vote yet. He would find out tomorrow when Katie called him, her voice bright with something he had not heard from her in a long time. But tonight, the waves were calm, and the sky was full of stars, and the world was quiet in the way that only honest things can be.